Okay, if I make a start, as people are still filtering in, but we'll do the intros and housekeeping, and then we can move on to our very interesting subject today, which is the sector risk profile. So, welcome everyone, and thank you very much for joining us this morning. My name is Samantha Grix. I'm a partner at Devonshires, and I'm really pleased to be joined by Sharon Thandi, who is a senior associate in at Devonshires, and Joanne Morgan from Altair, who is a director. So you'll hopefully be hearing some words of wisdom from Joanne from her in-RP experience, from her inspections and other type of experience. And Sharon is very, very experienced on the regulatory and governance side. So she'll be bringing that experience with her today. Okay, so what we're going to look at today, we're going to look at the latest sector risk profile, which was issued in October 2024. We wanted to give it a little time to bed in to see where everyone is at with it, but also given the influx of consumer gradings that we've had over the last few months, we also thought it would be good to see what came rather than rushing in. So hopefully we'll have a little bit more of an insight than we would have done if we'd done this webinar in October. Within this session, we're going to look at what's new and what the regulator has got some increased focus on in the latest profile, lessons learned, which Joanne's going to lead on, and have a look at what we've learned from previous and what we've got to think about, and also managing and minimizing risks. So hopefully you'll come away with this from this session with some insight and some thoughts about going forward about how to strengthen your RP position. So I'm going to touch on competing pressures because obviously there are competing pressures on every level. RPs have been at the forefront of the political agenda for a long while now, and you've been hit with the stick quite a lot in terms of higher requirements and expectations. So increased costs are obviously one of the biggest issues that we have at the moment, and that was only made more prevalent with the change in national insurance requirements. So increased costs competing against all of the increased legal and regulatory requirements that have been forced upon you by way of the Building Safety Act, with damp and mold is still a big issue, and looking at all of these different things and the investment you need to put into your housing, that increased cost and lower income in some respects, which was sort of created the situation was worsened when we had the 7% cap 23 to 24. So increased costs are a big issue, which are not going away, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that and how and what is expected of RPs in this environment. Now, development, obviously, that everyone wants to be developing, but many people are not developing, or they're not making any plans to put new developments in the pipeline purely because all of the money they have are going into existing stock to bring it up to spec or improve it. We also need to think about competition for resources and services. We know that there's been a big struggle in finding enough contractors, enough staff to be able to resource the sector. And with the implementation of requirements for qualifications, it remains to be seen how much more difficult that's going to be, or if that will change things somewhat in terms of operationally within the housing association. But obviously, the contractor side of things is something that is still ongoing as well. Zero carbon, obviously, everyone's working towards that, which is tricky. And the final point, because I've touched on the others, is the more difficult funding environment. Funding is really difficult. It's more expensive. So we're having to deal with that. Okay, so future pressures, spending review. There's a line-by-line review going on. So it remains to be seen what's going to come of that. Decent homes too. So what additional requirements are going to be required of RPs? Again, that is something we wait to see what comes of that, and that's likely to come this year. Mandatory electric safety testing is an additional cost, an additional safety measure to be factoring in. I know RPs, generally have that data and that they do some electrical testing, but this is obviously going to be aligned with sort of the requirements relating to gas safety. So it will require a shift in processes, procedures, etc. AWAB's law is incoming, as is the competence and conduct standard, which I mentioned. So there are further things that are coming your way, which will need to be factored into your strategy and your plans as to how you're going to implement those new requirements, and also fund them in the face of these competing interests and cost rises. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Sharon now, who's going to look at some new focuses which have been detailed in the 2024 sector risk profile. Thanks, Sharon.
Thanks, Sam. Morning, everybody. Thanks again for joining us on this webinar. As Sam mentioned, I'm going to look at some of the new focuses. When I'm talking about some of these new focuses, though, I think some of you will know that this also in some ways isn't anything too new, as some of these pressures have existed for a number of years now. Some of the wording in the sector risk profile changed in terms of how these risks were phrased, but it's not I'm not claiming at all to have had a special insight and producing this financial pressure slide saying that no one else has already spotted this risk. So we know that there are increased financial pressures in the sector, and we've seen the headlines over the past couple of months. I think there was a headline just the other day in social housing around the EBITDA MRI cover having dropped below 100% for the first time since 2009, and that's really essentially showing that the cost of servicing debt has exceeded net earnings across the sector. We've seen, if you've heard the regulator speak over the last few months, talking about some of the financial pressures echoing the circumstances we saw before the financial crash in 2008-ish, although the sector isn't in that same position, I should say. So not quite panic stations or saying that we are in that similar situation of the financial crash, but there are some similarities in the economic conditions at the moment. The regulator does view the sector as generally being resilient, so that is a positive message for the sector. It is a resilient sector, it is a strong sector. However, because of this pressure, particularly in regards to servicing your debt, lots of landlords will now have less capacity, and that means you have less financial headroom than in previous years. The knock-on effect of that is that the regulator is saying boards particularly need to be more active in their management of organisations and more active in their management of the key strategic decisions, because there is that lesser room for error. You've got a lesser room, a margin there when you're making your decisions. We know is absolutely critical for you as landlords to continue to be well run and financially viable. That's the absolute requirement in the governance and financial viability standard. All of that is in the context of the increased pressures that Samantha mentioned on the earlier slide, the increased financial costs and spending that you as landlords are incurring in terms of important safety work, and identifying and addressing issues before they happen so you can be proactive in managing risks. All of that whilst you're also meant to be meaningfully engaging with the increase in supply agenda and essentially, tackling the very acute housing crisis we have in the sector. We have seen a record level of expenditure on investment in the sector, and that's investment in existing homes. Investment comes in all different forms and driven by different issues, particularly around decarbonisation, building safety and remediation costs, and also investment in the quality of your existing stock, so bringing it up to decency levels, and in some cases preparing for potential decent home standard too. Some of these pressures are different in different areas of the country. So, for example, landlords in London and in urban areas will have different financial pressures and different investment need pressures based on their stock profile, particularly landlords that have a large number of flats that are in need of building safety remediation work. So it is a different picture depending on where you are as an organisation. And I think some of the stories we've seen in the sector reflect that, with, certain providers in certain areas having, faced different challenges based on their stock profile. But one thing is clear, that there is a mounting spend on repairs and maintenance though, and it's that is forecast to continue to increase. I think the forecast at the moment is that it will reach 50 billion in the next 5 years. We know there's a big pressure around the repairs and maintenance services for lots of providers, which is being compounded by skill shortages, labour shortages, and also material shortages. So, it's a very challenging picture all round on this. I would say that what this is creating is a situation where you do have that high cost of debt, and that is coming with that higher than expected interest rate cost. And whilst the sector, has been praised for its strong liquidity position, I think it's also important to note that a number of landlords will soon be needing to refinance, and they'll be refinancing on higher rates or potentially on variable rates. So that could have further pressures on liquidity in the sector. So it's important to manage that risk. As I mentioned already, that means it is harder to manage the downside of risk. So when you are taking strategic decisions, there is a smaller margin for error now when you're making those decisions, and it's really important to understand what the risks are, what the impairment costs could be, what the downside could be to any of your decisions. Lastly, on this slide, I just wanted to say the sector risk profile also discusses the reliance on fixed asset disposals, fixed asset sales. In the sector generally, we are seeing a substantial reduction in new development spending. So we are seeing less spending on new development and on that cross-subsidy model of development in private sale to cross-subsidise the social housing activity. And we are seeing increases in fixed asset sales to generate further funds for providers. There are risks associated with relying on fixed asset sales. In some cases, it makes just strategic sense. In other cases, it can be, one of the measures to help improve an immediate liquidity position, but it can be sometimes a short-term solution to plug a gap rather than a longer-term solution around securing your financial viability. So providers need to really think carefully around their decision making and how they're going to ensure financial viability going forwards. Next slide, please, Sam. So all of those financial pressures are also complemented by having increased regulation around stock quality, safety and compliance with the new consumer standards coming into force in April this year. I do keep saying, how long do we keep calling them new for? I wonder maybe post-April whether we stop saying new, but yes, so the new consumer standards were tabled and enforced from April. And there was a real shift in focus of the consumer standards, and we have a tightening of regulatory requirements around stock quality, around the safety of homes, and the compliance information that boards need to be satisfied with to ensure they are receiving that adequate assurance. The safety and quality standard sets out those specific expectations around having that accurate and up-to-date data. And that includes having complete stock condition information for each individual property. So, that can be based on a physical survey. So looking at your stock condition data. Do you have stock condition surveys for your stock? Are you at 100% for your stock condition surveys, or do you have gaps? How are you plugging those gaps? Are you using cloned data or extrapolated data? What are the risks associated with using cloned and extrapolated data? They're all things that boards need to be carefully thinking about, ultimately to be able to have that assurance that they know what the safety and quality of their homes is, and so that can inform, their decision making moving forwards. The regulator basically sees if boards don't have that information in the first place, then how is a board able to make that informed decision to, sometimes make the tough decisions around investment or the priority of servicing or the priority of, spend on maintenance. So it's key to have that stock condition information. You must also understand the condition of your properties and how that's going to inform, spending going forward on areas such as net zero, decarbonisation, and also any changes that the government's going to potentially announce, particularly thinking about Decent Home Standard 2, and also around any changes around minimum efficiency levels. So thinking in the future, what's the future spending plan looking like, so that you can plan well in advance for that. We have seen in recent regulatory downgrades and judgments that landlords have there have been instances essentially highlighted where landlords have had an inadequate approach to their stock condition data. They either have inadequate levels of stock condition surveys, or there's a heavy reliance on cloned or extrapolated data, essentially meaning that they just don't have the good quality data in the first place to really understand what the condition of their homes is. And that essentially means that you as a landlord, you can't provide evidence of compliance with your health and safety requirements. You can't provide evidence to show that you provide a good quality, safe home to your residents. If we think about that, the data that you need to back these decisions must be robust and of good quality. You should have appropriate control mechanisms in place to ensure that data is of good quality. And I think we'll talk about that in a couple more slides. But without that, you're missing the piece in terms of making those informed decisions. So it's really important to have good quality data and timely data and up-to-date data to inform your decisions around your health and safety and quality requirements around homes. We know we have the Building Safety Act and the new building safety regulator. That regulatory regime has its own pressures in terms of compliance and needing to comply with that regime, including costs that could be incurred by having to comply with that regime. So landlords that have properties that require registration under the building safety regime need to be thinking about what that looks like for them moving forwards, how those costs are managed, and if there are works that are needed, how those works are also costed out. On damp and mold still is a area of issue for the sector, and there is still increased focus on damp and mold cases and remediating cases of damp and mold. We are in the middle of winter now, and we know generally based on the seasons in this country that winter is a time where damp and mold is, prevalent, and we can see higher numbers creeping up again around damp and mold cases. Again, providers really need to be clear on any damp and mold cases, and particularly where they are of a condition where they are potentially category 1 or 2 hazards, and how landlords are going to prioritise remediating those cases, particularly taking into account specific vulnerabilities of the residents who are facing those conditions. So again, landlords can't take their eye off the ball around damp and mould either. This is a very important consideration, particularly for this time of year. And then right at the bottom on that slide, we've got understanding your obligations. So all this means essentially is that you as an organisation, your board, your strategic team, your executive team must understand your legal and regulatory obligations and ensure that you have the evidence to demonstrate compliance. If the regulator came tomorrow and asked you, how are you satisfied that you're meeting the requirements, that you have evidence-backed decision-making showing how you are complying with the standards. Thanks, Sam. So onto data integrity. This is more of an area of continued focus rather than anything new. And this isn't really a new message. I think we've heard for lots of years now around the need to have good quality data. And I've already said it during this webinar today. So not a new message, but something just to, continue to be aware of as it continues to be focused on within the sector risk profile. The regulator expects landlords to have that robust data to underpin their decision-making and assurance in their decision-making. Risks can arise where providers might be relying on fragmented data systems or manual data entry, possibly outdated IT systems, or a lack of standardized data entry. So have a look at what your data infrastructure is in your organization, and if that is potentially opening you up to risks moving forwards. We've seen instances where we've been advising clients who have, in some cases, possibly relied on manual data entry, and that can create risks because of human error or lack of control over a document. So it's important to make sure that you have a thorough analysis of your data infrastructure and where potential risks might lie in undermining your data quality. That's really important because of the increased focus in the consumer standards around data. I've already talked about it in the realm of the stock condition data and the stock condition surveys. required under the safety and quality standard. But I just wanted to mention quickly also your requirements around TSM reporting. You need to have strong, robust data to be able to provide accurate TSM reporting as well. The TSM requirements are all around having that performance data that is comparable across the sector. So you need to ensure that you have the right data to be able to comply with your TSM requirements. On this slide, we've also got understanding your obligations versus third-party obligations. This is really important where if you're a provider and you're contracting out services, or if you're contracting, anything else, any other functions, understand where your responsibilities sit and where you've delegated responsibility. I would say, though, the key thing here is boards should understand that ultimate responsibility will lie with you as the landlord. You're responsible for your regulatory compliance. So if you are contracting out any activities, you as an organisation should continue to receive assurance that whoever you've delegated to is carrying out those services in accordance with your responsibilities as a regulated landlord. We see particularly sometimes with smaller providers who might not have staff, for example, they will contract out pretty much all of their services to a managing agent, for example. It's really important, though, that that small provider still receives assurance that that managing agent is doing what it's supposed to, whether that be around health and safety or even rent setting. We have seen some providers face difficulties where they potentially haven't received that assurance, or managing agents aren't quite up to date with regulatory changes, and then that leaves the RP landlord in trouble in terms of their regulatory compliance. So that's quite an important piece. I think the last 2 points on this slide I've covered already around your stock condition data. And the key thing here is that using that data to make those tough decisions around, prioritising your strategic decisions, prioritizing your service delivery, and prioritizing, your spend. Where are you going to spend? Are you going to prioritize investment? Are you going to prioritize new supply? And having to make those tough trade-offs. If we look at counterparty risk now, again, this isn't something new. It's an increase, it's a continued area of focus in the sector risk profile. And if we remember the collapse of Carillion in particular, that's when I can really recall this being mentioned in the sector risk profile can't even remember now what year it was, but a good few years ago. So counterparty risk continues to be a risk for RPs to manage, particularly because the economic circumstances we've talked about earlier today are faced by pretty much, everybody in every sector. So your contractors are also facing a tough macroeconomic climate and managing costs and other pressures that they're facing. So it's really important for you as providers to understand what that counterparty risk is. We know insolvency levels in 2024 were higher than pre-pandemic levels. I think they weren't as high as the recession, but there are still, the insolvency levels are ticking upwards, and that's particularly in the construction sector, which isn't necessarily a big surprise to anybody. So think about when you're entering into agreements or arrangements with third parties, particularly developers, what those arrangements are and how robust they are, and how you're mitigating any potential risks of insolvency. We have seen instances where contractors have failed, and that will result in impairments and from increased costs essentially on development, also halts in timescales and what that means for your business plans moving forward. It's really important to build that risk in. As I said, it's really important where you are contracting out services, and not just development services, but any services to third parties, that you remember that you retain that ultimate responsibility. So you need to be sure that who you're contracting with is, a reputable organisation that will follow your policies and procedures and do what you need it to. So you should have clear mechanisms for monitoring on an ongoing basis within your contract. Your contract should also reflect the new requirements of the consumer standards. So that's a really important consideration moving forwards, and something that we have been stressing with clients, particularly since April 2024, to make sure that your arrangements stack up against your new requirements. And also, before you even enter into that contractual arrangement, think about the due diligence that you're doing on your contracting partner. Are you looking at their financial position? Are they in a strong enough position to deliver what you want them to deliver? Are you looking at potentially any risks around not just financial, but also reputational risks? What is the reputation of that contractor? How do they provide their services? What would be the reputational risk if they were to fail? So building all of that in will be really important, and that's a key part of due diligence. Lastly, although I'm not a pensions expert, I will quickly touch on the pensions risks we are seeing. Um, Lots of landlords will have exposure to defined benefit schemes in terms of your pension arrangements, and those financial obligations are remeasured on a triennial basis, which means that you, as a provider, can be basically at the risk of increased costs based on those revaluations. There are proposed changes to the calculations of the RPI with CPI H coming in. I think that's around 2030 that's being proposed. So that will have a direct effect on the funding levels for many schemes. So something to be aware of in the next few years as a risk going forwards. You should understand as an organisation, your boards should understand as an organisation what that means for you, what that means for your pension scheme going forward, particularly if you have those defined benefit schemes, and what that means for any changes in cost to your contribution levels, and making sure that's been adequately accounted for in your business planning going forward.
Thank you, Sharon. Right, I'm just going to do the next slide and then I'm going to hand over to Joanne. Rent setting, lead on rents at Devonshires, and rent setting is a continued focus for the regulator, because I think it's one of those things that is so easily gotten wrong, or it may have been got wrong previously and it's only now being picked up. So the need for transparency is very much amplified in the 2024 sector risk profile, and the transparency point is quite tricky actually, and something that I advise on quite a lot as to what point should you be letting the regulator know that there's been some errors in rent setting. Now, my general feeling on it is if it's really low value, very small number of residents, you wouldn't necessarily need to. But we had a client who had a relatively low figure in errors of rent setting, but the regulator was a bit peeved because they didn't self-refer on the basis there had been any breach. So I think you've got to take a bit of a careful view of it if you do deal with any rent regulation breaches, and whether you just flag it as a matter of course, to let them know that you've got it all in hand, but you've identified it, just to keep that transparency and that trust with the regulator, because the last thing you want to do is upset them and then them think you're not being totally candid with us. So self-referring is something that you really do need to think about, and when and what information you provide them. But it's very much a push in the current profile, and I don't think it's going anywhere, because rent regulation is such a complicated it's got such a complicated history that we have to comply with. And so, I mean, Joanne, your colleagues in your finance department will do the sort of analysis, and you have to know the history of rent regulation, which means that you need that within within your organisation to understand what rents should have been set at the time. And the staff shortages point is very much prevalent in rent, because I don't think it's not the most exciting of parts of the sector. I love it. I find it very interesting, but not everyone does. And so keeping getting staff and retaining them to specialize in rent is really challenging. So I think that is something to have a think about. Are your rent people, have you got a robust team there? What happens if one person went? Because what we see fair amount is that, so and so did the rents, they know how they set the rents and why they set them at that, but no one else does. And you need to be making sure that rent setting is and the explanation for it is being escalated up so that everyone understands, the board knows why the rent's being set that way, or if you do find an error, the board understand what that error is and the cost of that error, because if rents are inaccurate, then it's a compounding effect. You can't necessarily pick up the difference, and that goes for the rented sector, but also shared ownership rents. And I'm going to move on to fraud in a second. I won't bang on too long about rents. But shared ownership rents are also a sort of emerging issue that we're seeing. And this has not been picked up in the sector risk profile, but I know the regulator is aware of it because the rent setting for shared owners is specific to the lease. So depending on the age of that lease, you have to increase the rent in accordance with the formula in the lease. And that's not necessarily what organizations do. They just set a standard figure across. So we're seeing more and more issues in respect of shared ownership rents. So I would, if you're thinking about rents, it's not just your rented housing, it's also your shared ownership housing that I would be looking at. And although that's not technically covered by the rent standard, you do have to comply with all relevant law. And with rents, it often comes into board assurance and what did the board know? And have you got sufficient controls internally? And if your shared ownership rents are not being set correctly, then that's a breach of those leases. Technically, you could be in breach of lending covenants. There are consequences, and the refunds relating to shared owners is often quite significant. So just something to think about there, because that Sharon mentioned, that the board need to really have tight controls on what's happening within the organisation. There is very little headroom for things to go wrong. So if you get your rents wrong and you owe X amount of money, that is going to impact on what you have to spend and invest in your current properties or develop new properties, or could potentially affect your viability. So rents are so important. They make, that's where your money comes from. So it's really important they are correct. Fraud is the other point I'm going to talk about. This is the regulator notes in the sector risk profile how we are all more reliant on online platforms and the risks that come with that. So we need to make sure that our security is as strong as it possibly can be. And there is reference in the document saying that we should be getting third-party expert advice if you do become aware of any type of fraud. Now, fraud obviously comes in different guises. So, this mentions the cyber side of things because that's what's sort of continued and is a massive area. But we're also talking about fraud by tenants who aren't living there and subletting. And we know from the tenancy standard that came, was published in April 2024, that there is a duty on RPs to proactively identify tenancy fraud. So it's really important that we also have a renewed sort of perspective on it from that point, because we do need to be a bit more proactive about tenancy fraud. Okay, I'm going to pass over to Joanne.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you ever so much. Good morning, everybody. As highlighted, I jotted down a tough operating environment. I'm going to say very tough operating environment, just listening to Samantha and Sharon there. Really tough operating environment, high number of competing pressures, all hitting business plans as many people are going into to budget rounds at this moment in time. So from our work in the sector, the next few slides focus on some of those lessons learned and sharing some insight really for you this morning, and do reiterate quite a few of the points that Sharon has mentioned in the earlier slides with reference to consumer standards. We've seen the importance of a clear corporate strategy and that link through to the business plan, which has got to be clearly aligned to the purpose of the organisation. There needs to be a clear link, a clear focus on the objectives and how decisions are being made, and how those decisions are made that support the delivery of those objectives and your overall strategy. So clear linkage all the way through. Samantha highlighted the competing pressures right at the start of this session, and that there will need to be trade-offs. And we're seeing a number of boards now considering a hierarchy of trade-offs. What would be done first? What would be the priorities? With those increasing costs on repairs that Sharon highlighted, development challenges, net zero, national insurance increases, increased borrowing, that, just as a few of those examples, alongside other stakeholders that you're working with, reducing services in your communities. All of these pressures are facing RPs. So it's really important to understand the interplay of risks and the impact on the business plan. There's a need for robust stress testing required, and the board should receive the full set of stress tests and gain assurance that the organisation can withstand a reasonable range of adverse scenarios. In terms of communication, as you all know, it's key, and why decisions are being made, and what you can do, what you can't do, and why you can't do everything. It's vital that that's communicated and managed alongside those reputational risks as well. There's data being published around the tenant satisfaction measures. You've got regulatory judgments being issued. You've got housing ombudsman cases. A lot of information is there, and the impact on your reputation is key in that. Communicating with stakeholders is really important. We've already mentioned the early engagement with funders being key, as the impact of the financial pressures will play out in your long-term financial plans. And the external scrutiny, greater than ever before, as it says there on the slide, it will continue. It's coming from every angle. The government have got a very keen eye on the sector. You've a range of regulators that you're having to meet requirements for, but also customer expectations are increasing as well. So it's important that when you're looking at those, communicating those trade-offs, all of those things are considered. If we could go to the next slide, please, Samantha. Thank you. So what we observe from our governance work and the inspection support that we undertake with landlords is the need for a really clear, robust risk and internal control framework. And it's being aligned to your strategic risks. And it sounds very simple when you say it like that, but there's so many complicated frameworks in play at the moment. It can be quite challenging for board members to sort of really understand how the interplay of risks play out in a business. The strategic risk register very often appears on a board agenda or an audit committee agenda, but they cannot sit in isolation. There's got to be a clear risk assessment statement set by the organisation and a clear risk framework in place. The risk assessment needs to be aligned to the corporate strategy, and then those key risks identified along with a very clear mitigation strategy which has been tested. What could you stop doing, and what would that give you if you did stop? So I mentioned the hierarchy that's being used by many organisations. And it can't all rely on being able to sell assets. There needs to be other mitigations in place as well. So board must also ensure that they are assured that controls are in place to manage or mitigate the risks, and that they are operating effectively, and that the board can clearly see what the top risks to the business are. That clear linkage through to your risk appetite, the direction of risk that's being taken, but also, as Sharon highlighted, have confidence in the information that's being provided. And the board's getting assurance from officers throughout organisations. We're also seeing deep dives being undertaken at audit and risk committees to be able to really understand the risk to the business, how that plays, and have the linkage with other risks in the business, but also getting that third party assurance as well is part of the 3 lines of defence. And it's having that assurance on some of the data integrity, that the systems and the controls are also in play. Thank you, Samantha. If we could go to the next one. That's lovely. We're going to look at group activities here and the intergroup contagion risks. So from a governance perspective and a management of risk, board oversight of all group activities is crucial to protect social housing assets. There are very large and complex structures that can be challenging. And as Samantha was talking about rents there, some of the corporate memory is key as well, Samantha, when you're trying to remember all the different entities as they've merged into the new entity. And it can be the same here. So it can be challenging for a board to have oversight of all group activities. They need to be aware of the intergroup lending. They need to understand the impact of subsidiary defaults. and whether there is sufficient knowledge, skills and experience to provide that scrutiny and challenge is an area that should be considered when boards are completing their skills audit. Have they collectively got the skills, knowledge and experience to be able to do this? As RPs looking at other revenue sources through diversification as well, this is on the radar of the regulator. Group structures is an area that is considered as part of the inspections and was done previously as part of the IDAs as well. As part of the inspection, and as I've said, the previous IDAs, there's also consideration of optimising resources to deliver your purpose and your strategic objectives, and being able to clearly demonstrate that the cost and benefits of alternative structures have been considered. So it's really important that that's part of your considerations. With the challenges being faced and the risks as well, many organisations are looking at where stock sits. We're seeing quite a few stock transfers take place across the sector. So where providers have stock nationally, but have a very small number in a certain location, they are looking at the moment to transfer some of that stock to a main provider in a particular region. So we are seeing a lot of stock rationalisation taking place. Partnership working is also being considered across sharing services, whether that be repairs or customer call centres, but also the development frameworks that have been in operation for a long time. But with smaller organisations as well, a number of organisations are exploring partnership working to manage some of the risks that they face. And many organisations are revisiting their long-term financial plans currently and considering if a merger is an option. Many clients are saying to us, we are okay now, we are okay for the next 5 years or so, but could we do things quicker? Could we do them better if we joined forces with another organisation? So quite a bit of merger activity we're seeing again in the sector. So we'll leave you with some areas to consider. How confident are the board on consumer matters and the link to the risk profile? We've highlighted that clear linkage for you this morning, hopefully. What do you know about your homes? Sharon highlighted in one of her slides about the stock condition data. Are you meeting decent home standards? What's the impact of your stock condition surveys on your business plans? What's the impact of net zero? What's included in your business plans? And the risk of not knowing has been clearly articulated in some of the regulatory judgments that have been recently announced, where C3 grades have been awarded, where it has been highlighted there's a lack of accurate data around stock, lack of quality information around stock. And in terms of services provided, you are reliant on the data that you receive, and you need to get assurance on that data. But can you deliver the services required with all these competing pressures? And that's a risk to the business. Stock condition survey, as I've said, is resulting in a significant increase of repairs. It's quite a scary figure Sharon gave you earlier on, but a massive increase in repairs. What's the impact on the budget? What's the impact on your long-term financial plan? And is this known and understood? And in terms of health and safety compliance, the need to have adequate systems and processes to ensure legal health and safety assessments are undertaken in timescales. We're seeing a lot of focus on service delivery and tenant engagement, but this still is a huge risk for the organisations. So health and safety compliance is key. And data integrity, that consumer standards is all around knowing your homes and knowing your customers and how services are shared, and that's all coming from the data that you receive. So as we've highlighted, is the data secure and is it reliable? And then finally, number of regulatory judgments that have been issued highlight weaknesses in the area of stress testing. Clear need for the board to see robust stress testing and be involved in those discussions, be involved in the mitigation planning also. Frameworks, risk management frameworks need to be live. Elements cannot sit in isolation. They all need to be linked. The purpose, your strategy, your strategic risk, your risk appetite, your risk tolerance, linkage with golden rules and clear mitigation plans. And board oversight. risk has got to be key to all discussions and all decision making. The impact that the decisions you make have elsewhere in the business. So the impact that you have on a decision, how does that impact other areas of the business, and is that being considered in discussions? And having those deep dives to provide assurance that controls are operating effectively. Questioning whether you have all of that information will help you going forward. Thank you, Samantha.
Thank you, Joanne. That's brilliant. Thank you so much. Right, that's our final slide. The last one is just our emails and contact details. So the slides will be sent out to you. So I'm going to stop the share, and then if anyone's got any questions, please do put them in the question box, and then we can pick them up.
I would say we have had a couple of questions previously around subsidiaries and that intragroup contagion of risk. And a bit of a shameless plug from me, but on the 28th of January, we do have another webinar titled Fit for the Future, where we will be exploring your group structures, how to optimize your group structures and ensure they're meeting your strategic goals, but also you're meeting your regulatory requirements and managing that risk appropriately. In particular, thinking about, yes, it's important to ring fence, riskier activity, diversified activity in a subsidiary, but we have seen some providers struggle where actually that independence of that subsidiary is undermined by, other arrangements that you might have in place. So it's important to actually test how much is the risk ring fenced in reality, and how are you making sure that you are protecting your social housing assets in the core business. So if that's an area that you're interested in and looking at group structures generally, then please do sign up for our webinar on the 28th of January, and there should be details on our website.
Talking about the ring fencing, Sharon, I think it's such a topical thing, isn't it, at the moment? And word on the street is that we're going to be potentially getting new economic standards in the coming year or two, and that is going to be something that's going to be focused on, is how are you really protecting, and do we need to look at our, when we're looking at the risks and how everything interplays together, do we need to look at our rescue and recovery plans? And there's a question about whether that might be formalized by the regulator. So what were called living wills, and the G15 did they provided a note on this a couple of years ago now, but living wills is something that we've spoken to Jonathan Waters about at the regulator, and he's very interested in it, and it seems to be something that they are going to be wanting to push. So having a think about what that would look like for your organization, and whether you think you would be ready should that be brought in. And obviously there'll be lead-in time, but the rescue and recovery plan point, Joanne spoke about knowing your risk and where they are, and do the board understand where those risks are, is just so important. Joanne, can I throw a question at you?
Yeah, sure.
One of the questions, which I think is a good one, is you mentioned the golden rules. And what are they?
So the golden rules is a set of criteria that's set by the organisation in conjunction executive and the board. It's your triggers. It's your tolerances that are set. So very often around covenants will be in there as well. Your EBITDA MRI, there'll be a percentage that's set, and there'll be a buffer sometimes, if that's the right word, a buffer that will be set, and then there'll be a trigger. And if you're approaching that trigger, then there's conversations that take place. So it's like an early warning system, but the golden rules are often set alongside your financial business planning, and need to have that clear link through to your stress testing. Brilliant, thank you. I think my finance colleagues could have probably answered that better, but hopefully that answers the question.
No, I think that was very good, very succinct. So somebody has put in a really, really apt question. Is there any good news for the sector? I think Sharon, please.
I was going to say, I think the nature of this webinar is, very much us telling you about the risks and all the, potential areas of difficulty for the sector. So I think the tone of this webinar, based on what we're covering, is a tough one in terms of good news for the sector. What I will say, though, is there are still, the points around it is a difficult economic climate, but the sector generally is resilient, and generally there is, decent levels of liquidity in the sector. So I think as a sector, we can take comfort from that. And whilst there are warning signs around troubling, interest cover percentages and things like that, there's also some comfort that we're not at, financial crisis levels of, 2008, 2009.
Yeah.
So, it's important to be aware of the risk, but also, that we are generally a resilient sector to these challenges moving forward. We'll, sometimes when you look at a diagram, you see the risk. Risk is often a time for opportunity as well. So I think there are opportunities now that are emerging in the sector, and providers are thinking, outside of the box of how you're going to meet these ever increasing challenges. And whilst we have seen quite a lot of merger activity in the sector, we are also seeing an increase in, meaningful collaboration as well, where I think previously there wasn't so much a drive to explore collaboration, almost sometimes a bit of a skepticism because it could sometimes be seen as a stage one to merger, whereas now collaboration is being, championed in a different way.
Yeah.
We've seen the sustainability partnerships in particular doing really great work around the decarbonisation programme. So there are some opportunities for sure, and possibly hope we'll take that feedback for our next webinars and make sure we're giving some more uplifting messages as well.
Yeah. I think, something you touched on there, Sharon, the innovation that we're seeing with clients and different ideas they're bringing to the table. Some are goers, some are just not. But people are really thinking, and as you said, it's such a resilient sector. You've had so much thrown at you, since the tragedy of Grenfell. Really, everything has been upended and so much has been thrown. And then we've had other things along the way that, you have grabbed them. And I think there's a lot to be taken from that. And those who don't work in the sector, I mean, it's our day to day. So we're sort of we're in the trenches with you to a certain extent. But those who aren't in the sector, I don't think they necessarily see everything that goes on and all the good work and the hard work and the really good intentions. And that may be something that, that's been polarized a little bit by the political involvement, and Gove sending letters saying I want data within a month on damp and mold from everyone, and getting it in the headlines for political purposes. That doesn't help, and hopefully we'll see a bit of a dial down of that, because I think the current government are trying to do more, aren't they?
Sure.
Whether it'll work, we'll see.
I'll also just touch on Paul Medford's question here around the regulator accepting interest cover below 100% for a period of time. I think the sector risk profile already notes that it's not looking to, there's no uptick for, I think, at least the next financial year, the year after. So I think they're already anticipating that it's going to remain below 100% for a period. And I think they recognise the realities of the sector and the challenges that you're facing, which is why they publish these sector risk profiles in the first place. What I would say though is I do still expect to see a high percentage of V2s in the sector, because you are making those challenging decisions, and there will be trade-offs. So I think that was the message a few years ago, even, that V2 could be seen as, a bit more of a norm. So V1, V2 is obviously still compliant, but V2 recognises the challenges that you are facing as providers, different to a G1, G2, whereas G1 is still, the standard you should be achieving. It's not comfortable to be sitting at a G2. However, V2, on the other hand, I think will be more common in the sector.
I think I agree with you entirely. And we were having a conversation. I was having a conversation with Anne Marie yesterday, one of Joanne's colleagues, about V2 and whether we'll see, when we will start to see a shift of people. Are we going to see more going to V2? When are we going to see people moving up to V1? And there was, the regulator sent out some regulatory judgments yesterday, and there was a move up, wasn't there, from V2 to V1? I forget who it is now, but I think it is. To some extent, the viability point is out of your control when we're dealing with high interest rates. That's out of your control. But where you can take back control to a certain extent is in your governance, because by having that really robust, strategy and a little bit of headroom, that can man the ship to a safe and happy place.
Yeah. There's a question there, Samantha, just from Chris about third-party assurance of controls. There's I sort of had in mind, you've obviously got your internal auditors that will have an internal audit program, a strategic program, and then an annual program that provides assurance on the control frameworks that are in place, external auditors as well around the financial systems. Also, with the stock condition surveys, you're getting some assurance on the data that's being held. So there's some data assurance being there. As Sam mentioned, the rents, there's quite a lot of reviews of rents being undertaken, and data audits as well. So there's a number of ways in which you can seek third party assurance as one of the lines of defence. So hopefully that's helpful for Chris.
Yeah, I mean, I think the third party point, Joanne, is really important because sometimes you just need that for the rents, especially to audit the rents and check them, because it's a minefield.
Yeah, absolutely.
Another thing we've seen, Sharon and I are working on something at the moment where the issues relate to a subsidiary of a particular organisation, and it's been forgotten somewhat, and really sort of quite serious, governance issue really, as well as the financial side of things, but making sure that you're very clear on your structure and what is within your group, if you are a group, just having that understanding of your organization, your board having an understanding, because they're not doing the day-to-day. Your exec team will be doing the day-to-day. They come in and they're given some papers, so making sure those papers are really succinct and get the point across so they actually understand what's going on.
There's quite a lot of dormant companies out there as well that have been created at a point in time, and they still sit within a legal framework.
Exactly.
And I think part of the inspection process is sort of asking questions a little bit around that. When was it last reviewed? But that board awareness.
So we are drawing to a close for the session today. Once again, thank you all for joining us and for providing your insightful questions as well. It's been really helpful to engage with some of the points that you wanted to discuss. As Samantha mentioned at the outset, you will also receive a feedback survey. So please do fill that in. Let us know what worked for you, what didn't, and what else you'd like to hear from us about. As I said, it is a challenging time in the sector, but we're here to help as well. So if there are any areas that you would like to hear more from us on, then please do feed that back. If there's any questions based on what we discussed that come to you afterwards, please also let us know about those. Slides will be sent across along with a recording of the webinar following the session, so you will receive all that information to your sign up emails. But just once again, thank you for joining us today.